Islamic civilization has draped itself in glory for its many distinct achievements, be it in the shape of Muslim empires that conquered vast realms, or scholars that made major contributions to science and philosophy. But in the modern period, with the rise of European imperial powers, Islamic eminence has been greatly diminished. Most of the Dar al-Islam, the Islamic territories, came under the sway of powers such as Britain and France. This set off somewhat of an existential crisis for Muslim thinkers who grappled with the question of why their societies fell behind the Europeans. In the quest for an answer, intellectuals across the Muslim world engaged with a range of social and political ideas to help defend their societies against the might of Europe. Whilst modern Islamic thought is sometimes seen as being characterized by a lack of intellectual vigor, in this hour-long documentary, we will see how these thinkers in the 19th century often demonstrated an ambitious dynamism which addressed core issues such as modernization, national identity, and the ever-important issue of the role of Islam in society and politics. In the process, they laid the foundation for the two main schools of political thought that have since dominated the Islamic world. The first being a Western-inspired drive towards socio-political modernization, and the second being a reaction to that which saw Islam as the solution for the woes of their societies. In the late 1760s, the Mamluks, a military caste that had held political power in Egypt since the 13th century, rebelled under the leadership of Ali Bey al-Kabir and succeeded in declaring independence from Constantinople. Although this lasted for only 5 years, Ottoman central authority in the Arab world was under threat, with rebellious leaders in northern Palestine being a constant thorn in their side during this period as well. When Napoleon and his army landed on the shores of Alexandria in 1798, the Ottoman Egyptian authorities thought little of their advancements. Arrogant in their military strength, the Mamluks were confident that their cavalry would easily trample the invading Franks, just as they did in the last crusade. However, when they confronted the French armies, they were quickly overwhelmed. At the time, Napoleon's forces were the most professional in the world, and as they were flexible in their strategies, the Mamluks remained stuck in their centuries-old cavalry tactics. The defeat of the Mamluks at the hands of the French was not so much technical as it was structural. Napoleon's army had adopted innovative tactics regarding corps divisions, mobility, and the usage of artillery, while the Mamluks simply charged at their enemies with little to no strategy or command structure. This demonstration of superior French militarism was a shock to not just the Mamluks, but the entire Ottoman realm. The Ottoman Empire had for centuries seen itself as superior to Christian Europe in every aspect of governance, military, and culture. But with this swift defeat of the Khilafah's armies, the Muslims had a sudden realization of their own inferiority. For Napoleon, his victory over the Mamluks was simply destiny. He convinced his army and subjects that he had come to Egypt in order to liberate its people from the despotic Turks and Caucasians who had ruled the region for over 500 years. Napoleon even went so far as to proclaim himself to be more of a Muslim than the Mamluks he had defeated, showing great admiration of the Prophet Muhammad and encouraging the involvement of religious leaders in his own political circles. However, despite his flattering stances, Napoleon very much saw his campaign in Egypt as a civilizing mission, and local rebellions to his authority were met with extreme violence. Whilst much of the Egyptian public expressed their frustration to the French occupiers, many Egyptians also saw this period of colonial rule as a valuable lesson for their nation. They witnessed the technological and societal advancements that the French brought with them and began to ponder about how and why their society stagnated whilst the Europeans progressed. Humiliated by the shortcomings of their nation, Many Egyptians began to accept the French narrative of Ottoman incompetence and impiety. As the Caliphs of the Ummah, the Ottomans were tasked with the responsibility of maintaining Islamic prosperity and supremacy. But now, with France and the rest of Western Europe proving to be far more sophisticated in their customs and technology, the Ottomans had essentially failed the Muslim community. As a result, Egyptians, both Muslim and non-Muslim alike, began to resent the rule of Turks and looked to Napoleon's France as the new model of modernity. During his occupation, Napoleon had implemented institutional reforms to Egypt's administration, education, and military in a way that suited France's imperial aspirations. His military would include its own Mamluk cavalry corps, which would serve the French imperial army throughout its campaigns in Europe and Asia. The courts would continue to have a place for Islamic clerics, but French civil law was introduced as the backbone of this new government, which in turn changed the status of religious minorities from zimmi to equal citizens. To ensure the Francification of Egypt, Napoleon invited a large number of artists, engineers, intellectuals, and scientists to not only propagate the values of the Enlightenment, but also to conduct studies on Egypt's geography, history, and people. Studying in the French-established Institut d'Egypte, Napoleon's regiment of scholars documented the discoveries they made in the multi-volume Description de l'Égypte, which at the time was the largest publication in the world. This contained artwork and detailed descriptions of Egypt's animals, cities, landscape, history, and people. With the finding of the Rosetta Stone and other ancient artifacts, Napoleon's expedition set the foundations for the modern field of Egyptology, reinvigorating the glory of Egyptian civilization to both the Europeans, who saw it as a mysterious and exotic land, and the Egyptians who called it home. The reintroduction of ancient Egyptian history brought a sense of pride to the people of Egypt, who were beginning to see themselves as members of a unique and separate nation from that of the Ottoman Empire. The French had the habit of calling the local Bedouin tribes Arabs, which was something that the locals would rarely call themselves. They were Arabs in the sense that their tribes had their origin in Arabia, but the idea of identifying as an Arab people was not something that was at the forefront of their vernacular, as they usually referred to themselves as Ottoman subjects. However, with France now having a monopoly on Egyptian politics, education, and history, the social fabric of Egypt was catering itself to a European model of nationhood. To promote and propagate his civilizing mission, Napoleon introduced the printing press to Egypt, publishing articles in French, Greek, and most innovatively, Arabic. Although ridiculed by Egyptian scholars for its terrible grammar, the Arabic presses of Napoleon's Egypt were the most advanced in the Muslim world. Even though they were prevalent in the Ottoman Empire, the usage of the printing presses was mostly limited to elite Christian and Jewish merchants. Being a cursive calligraphy, Arabic was always far easier to handwrite than to print. But with the rapid production of literature and the need to become more European, Arabic printing presses were slowly becoming normalized in Egypt. With the introduction of new technology, philosophies, and approaches to state building, the French were setting the standards for what a modern nation should look like. Whilst initially opposed to the foreign occupation, Egyptian intellectuals and students were beginning to warm up to the French as their advancements in science, administration, and philosophy inspired them to improve their society. Napoleon, however, would never see the fruition of his efforts. By 1801, the Turkish armies and British navy expelled the French back to Europe and reinstated Egypt as an Ottoman province. In spite of being ousted from Egypt, the impact of the French occupation would forever influence the nation. The administrative, military, and technological reforms of the French were now becoming normalized in Egypt. The Institut d'Egypte continued being the province's main scientific institution, educating students on Enlightenment philosophy and science. The French language was promoted as being an essential skill of the modern thinker, and French administrative law and jurisprudence continued to undermine Islamic law decades after Napoleon's departure. The printing presses not only remained in use, but their utility was expanding to nearly every fabric of Egyptian society, greatly improving literacy rates, increasing the publication of literature, and slowly adapting the Arabic language into the modern standard script that is still in use today. Most importantly, the excavation of ancient Egyptian artifacts and the publication of the Description de l'Égypte reintroduced the West to the wonders of Eastern civilization. Europeans were fascinated by the exotic history and culture of the Eastern Muslim world, with authors and artists depicting the Muslim people and cities without even having visited them. This Western fascination and alienation of the East led to what we now call Orientalism, in which the people of the Orient, and more specifically Muslims, are depicted by Europeans as both captivating and threatening, a phenomena that remains very much prevalent to this day. Despite this explicit act of colonialism, the Egyptians who became the subject of European anthropology, propaganda, and imperialism did not view this era of occupation as a scar on their history. In fact, for Egyptians and much of the Arab world, Napoleon's invasion of Egypt was seen as a step forward. The arrogant Ottomans and Mamluks, who thought themselves as the epitome of imperial power, were humiliated by the likes of the Europeans they once saw as inferior. This defeat was a wake-up call to the Muslim world that they were in need of reform. This reform would not just be regarding Islamic governance, society, and technology, but more radically, Muslim identity. Identifying oneself as Arab was becoming increasingly common, despite the nationality not really being defined. Secular governance and education was isolating Islamic principles in spite of still being a majority Muslim society. The reintroduction of Egypt's history was reinvigorating a past pride that would determine the future for millions. This philosophical and political shift in the Muslim mind was confusing but ever so stimulating to think about. In Western academia, this period of Egyptian rethinking is often called the Arab Renaissance or the Al-Nahda, but to the people of Egypt and much of the Arab and Muslim world, this era was not so much a rebirth as it was rather an awakening. Relieved from their slumber, Islamic civilization was now on a course towards progress, and the question of what this progress should look like would forever shape the political climate that our world faces today. The French withdrawal from Egypt left in its wake a political crisis that drastically changed the course of Ottoman history. Despite the Ottoman armies recapturing Egypt, the territory would be under the rule of an Albanian mercenary unit known as the Bashibuzaks. Literally meaning crazy heads, the Bashibuzaks were loyal only to those who paid them for their services. Failing to compensate one of their toughest military units, the Egyptian Eyalet was overthrown by the Bashibuzaks in 1805. Replacing the Ottoman Pasha was an Albanian commander known as Muhammad Ali. During his first days in power, Muhammad Ali and his loyal army massacred the remaining Mamluk warlords and soldiers who had been in control of Egypt for over 600 years. Although a tyrant who ruled with an iron fist, the new Pasha was popular with the public as he attended to their financial needs and promised to bring about radical reforms to the Eyalet. While remaining to be a vassal of the Ottomans, Muhammad Ali's Egypt was leading the empire's reformation towards modernity. The first of his tasks was the restructuring of the military. For centuries, the Ottoman army was completely reliant on the Janissaries, an elite infantry unit that had managed to acquire immense influence in the empire's affairs. Due to their political power, the Janissaries prevented the Ottomans from reforming their military as it would mean a loss of their influence and worse, disbanding the unit entirely. When Sultan Selim III attempted this reform, the Janissaries had him assassinated in 1807 and replaced with his cousin, of whom they asserted full control of. With his mostly Albanian army being loyal only to him, Muhammad Ali did not have the trouble of dealing with the Janissaries. He established multiple military schools across Egypt that would teach new recruits French artillery, cavalry, and infantry tactics. An arms industry that produced muskets, cannons, and ships was quickly modernizing the military and making Egypt independent from European imports and manufacturers. To fund this new army, Ali industrialized Egypt's economy, training Egyptian workers on how to manufacture, smelt metal, and produce materials that they once imported from Europe. Egypt's sugar, cotton, and rice production soared, with all export-orientated enterprises being owned by the state. The royal monopoly of Egypt's industries allowed Muhammad Ali to allocate funds towards the further development of the Eyalet's economy and military, making it one of, if not the most productive provinces in the Ottoman Empire. By 1830, Muhammad Ali's Egypt resembled a modern European state, not only with its material gains, but also with its judicial reforms. A Western-style penal code was established which allowed for the use of non-Sharia evidence to be used during a criminal trial. Religious minorities were granted protection under the law as equal citizens. Secular laws also came with secular educational establishments, of which both civilian men and women could participate in. The rapid success of Muhammad Ali's Egypt impressed and intimidated the Ottoman Sultan Mahmud II, who was himself attempting to reform the empire. As well as having to deal with the influence of the Janissaries, Mahmud's reign consisted of fending off Russian invasions, Saudi insurgents, and Balkan rebellions. Since the ineffective and corrupt Janissaries remained in charge of the army, Mahmud relied on Muhammad Ali's Egypt for protection against the empire's nationalist revolts. It would not be until 1826 that Mahmud was able to disband the Janissaries entirely and replace them with a more modern army. Despite this reform, the new army conscription was slow, with Muhammad Ali's army remaining to be the top military force of the empire. Realizing that the Ottomans were dependent on him, the Egyptian leader declared independence from the empire and invaded the Levant in 1831. Crushing the new infant Ottoman army, Muhammad Ali's forces were on pursuit to Constantinople with the intention of overthrowing the empire. His plans were stifled by the great European powers of Britain, France, and Russia, who pressured the Egyptians into signing a peace agreement with the Ottomans. Threatened by Muhammad Ali's rapid modernization, the Europeans believed that keeping a weak Ottoman puppet was more in their favor than an ever-industrializing Egypt. Thus, maintaining Egypt's subordination to the Ottomans was of crucial interest to the European powers. The treaty ensured Egypt's status as an Ottoman vassal, but it allowed for Muhammad Ali's authority to be expanded into the Levant. The Ottoman-Egyptian War demonstrated just how vulnerable the Ottoman Empire had become, and that reformation was not only a new way of life, but a means of survival. To achieve modernization, Mahmud attempted to make his empire as European as possible. He began by establishing a council of ministers to act as the executive and legislative body of the government. Although all members were more or less appointed by the Sultan, their opinions and arguments could be heard on a bill before the Sultan's approval, influencing the legislation of the empire similar to that of a parliament. Judicially, Mahmud was introducing secular and European laws into the courts, relaxing restrictions on alcohol, and codifying all citizens of the empire as equals regardless of religion. With an increasingly European government and judicial system, Mahmud also encouraged the adoption of European fashion and attire. Ottoman officials, servicemen, and civilians were all pressured to wear European-inspired clothing, such as frock coats and bow ties. The traditional turban was restricted to be worn only in religious settings, while the simple fez became the official headwear of the military and high society. Interestingly, Ataturk's reforms almost a century later could be placed within the genealogy of late Ottoman reforms, which were driven by a desire to be more European-like. As the empire was becoming more European, its foreign relations with the Western powers were only growing more fruitful. Mahmud invested a great deal into the empire's foreign affairs office, establishing permanent embassies across the European continent, and securing a very strong alliance with the British Crown. This alliance would come in handy in 1839 when Muhammad Ali would once again challenge Mahmud's authority. Passing from tuberculosis, Mahmud would be succeeded by his 16-year-old son Abdul-Majid. Being young and inexperienced, Abdul-Majid relied on the armies of Austria, Britain and Russia for protection. The Second Ottoman-Egyptian War concluded with Abdul-Majid regaining authority over the Levant and the recognition of Muhammad Ali's dynasty as the legitimate rulers of the Egyptian Eyalet. With Egypt finally quelled, Abdul-Majid was now able to complete the reforms his father had initiated. In 1839, the young Sultan proclaimed the beginning of a Tanzimat era. Meaning reorganization, the Tanzimat reforms centered around changing Ottoman society into a more secular and modern one in the attempt to make the empire resemble its Western counterparts. In the years following Abdul-Majid's proclamation, the Ottoman Empire would reorganize its criminal code and financial system to be more secular in practice. Banknotes, post offices, identity cards, and a national census would be introduced to the empire as a means of becoming a modern society. To ensure a more cohesive Ottoman society, the Tanzimat encouraged a policy called Ottomanism, which ensured the legal protection of all ethnic, linguistic, and religious groups in the empire as equal citizens. The Devshirme, which forcibly recruited young boys as slaves, was abolished. Abdul-Majid's son and successor Abdulaziz would be the first sultan to visit Western Europe, consolidating a valuable alliance with both Britain and France. Across Anatolia and the Balkans, railway systems were connecting Ottoman cities. In Egypt, the Suez Canal opened, providing the ships in the Mediterranean passage to the Indian Ocean without having to travel around the entire African continent. Despite these radical state reforms, the Ottoman Empire continued to fall victim to a shrinking economy and divided public. Infected by nationalist revolts across its realm, the Ottomans were the sick man of Europe, an empire on the verge of demise. In spite of their efforts, the sultans continued to fail their subjects. Disgruntled by this incompetence, a coup d'etat would overthrow Abdulaziz in favor of his nephew Murad V. Murad had encouraged the establishment with a constitutional monarchy, but his mental and physical health proved counterproductive. Thus, he would be replaced by his half-brother Abdulhamid II. Within his first months as Sultan, Abdulhamid would see the establishment of the first ever Ottoman constitution and parliament. It was anticipated that becoming a more European government and allowing for general elections would quell nationalist fervour. The revolts, however, continued, and in 1878 Abdulhamid abolished the constitution and reinstated his rule as an absolute monarch. For the remainder of his reign, Abdulhamid would violently suppress the empire's dissidents and further indebt the empire to Western banks and governments. At this point, it was clear to observers that the Tanzimat was a failure. The goal of becoming more European in the hopes of achieving modernity and stability was only met with resistance and catastrophe. The reforms did improve public institutions and infrastructure, but the Ottoman Empire continued to decline nonetheless, and the public was losing ever more faith in the authority of the sultans. The Tanzimat may have failed to save the empire, but its impact on its imperial subjects was of monumental influence. Across the empire's vast and diverse realm, Enlightenment policies, philosophies, and technology inspired a new generation of intellectuals that advocated for their own brand of modernity. While the sultans were overseeing the political implementation of Enlightenment values, it was these new radical intellectuals that propagated the need for reformation. But just like their rulers, the intellectual class were stuck on how these reforms should be carried out. As time progressed, the question of reform was only evolving to be more complex. Reorganization was no longer just a matter of government restructuring, but also a question of national identity. What this new identity would entail depended entirely on just who these intellectuals were. In order to modernize their society, Muslim governments sent missions of students to Western Europe, which at the time was the global center of higher culture and learning. These students would return with their own observations regarding Western history, culture, and technology in the hopes that their success could be replicated back home. A generation of ambitious Muslim students and scholars alike pondered the question, is Islam compatible with the West? While many contributed to this new rise of Western learning, one student's account is of unique significance. The Egyptian Rifa Al-Tahtawi's works would be amongst the most important in Islamic history, as it is from his writings that the modern Muslim identity changes forever. Born in the Egyptian town of Tahta, Rifa Al-Tahtawi grew up right after Napoleon left his mark on Egypt. Studying to be an imam at Cairo's prestigious Al-Azhar University, Rifa was an excellent student who caught the attention of the school's sheikh, Hassan al-Attar, who was one of the first of the Islamic ulama to promote the need for reform. Hassan al-Attar recommended Rifa to be a part of a student mission to France that Muhammad Ali Pasha had initiated. In 1826, Al-Tahtawi had arrived in Paris where he was to study ethics, mathematics, philosophy, and the works of French authors such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Voltaire. By the time he returned to Egypt 5 years later, he was fluent in French and the head translator of the mission. In Egypt, Al-Tahtawi founded his own language school in Cairo and translated French literature on medicine, philosophy, history, and military tactics. His translations were essential in developing the administrative, military, and scientific reforms that Egypt and the rest of the Ottoman Empire were so keen on accomplishing. However, perhaps more important than his translated works was his memoir of living in Paris. Titled as The Extraction of Gold, an overview of Paris, Al-Tahtawi's travelogue not only documents his personal experiences in France, but also serves as an anthropological account of the French people. Before Al-Tahtawi, there were no travelogues about France in Islamic academia, as it was never really a place of vital interest until Napoleon's invasion of Egypt. In fact, his book purposely mirrors the Orientalist works of French authors who wrote about the culture and customs of his own Arab peoples. Written in the traditional Rihla travelogue genre, The Extraction of Gold contains poetic eulogies, hadith quotations, and very simple Arabic, which at the time was rare for Ottoman scholars as they would have mostly written in Turkish. More unusual is that many of the Arabic words that Al-Tahtawi uses in his text are loan words from French, such as academia for academy and opera for opera. This was of course revolutionary for Arabic literature as the book was attempting to revive a lost literary style, all while introducing new vocabulary which continues to be used today. In his book, Al-Tahtawi writes with the intention of learning from the French, as they have been able to attain the highest proficiency of 19th century philosophy and science. Being a devout and proud Muslim, he reminds the readers that it was the scholars of the Islamic world who were the precursors to the French in these advancements. Nevertheless, with those days long gone, Al-Tahtawi is left to question how and why the French were able to surpass the sophistication of his people. Though a student of the French, Al-Tahtawi remained arrogant in his piety as he still regarded the Franks as culturally and morally inferior infidels. He writes about the strange customs the French engage in, like sitting on chairs and eating with forks and knives. He was especially disturbed by the excessive drinking and risque burlesque shows that the French indulged themselves with, making his best effort not to fall into the temptation of sinful pleasures, or even worse, convert to Christianity. Despite their impiety, Al-Tahtawi knew that these infidels had much to offer him and his precious Islamic civilization, which was in desperate need of reinvigoration. Arriving in Paris, he was fascinated by the civil engineering of the city. He writes about how the roads are paved with stone that prevents the water from absorbing into the soil. There are sewers and funnels that direct the water out of the road and back into the river Seine, which serves as the lifeline of the city. With Cairo having the mighty Nile as its Seine, Al-Tahtawi believes that it can surpass Paris as the queen of cities if it were to adopt the former's techniques in civil engineering and hydraulics. But to achieve these technological feats, he understood that to be like the French, he and his fellow Muslims would have to think like the French. You see, in spite of being a predominantly Christian society, Al-Tahtawi makes the observation that the French are not as stuck in their old traditional ways of thinking like the Christians of Egypt. Rather, the French are willing to go beyond the realm of what they already know, all while gathering evidence to support their understanding of the natural world and the sciences. Despite being Muslim and faithful to his religion, Al-Tahtawi insists that he and his peers must adopt the secular sciences in order to truly modernize like the French. This was a radical position to take, as adopting a secular understanding of the world would ultimately undermine the divinity of the Islamic sciences. However, it was clear to Al-Tahtawi that the old ways of Islamic learning were stagnating their society, and that the new secular approach to science was advancing the French state far beyond what any Muslim country could achieve. To adopt the French sciences, Al-Tahtawi suggests more than just reading French literature. Instead, he argues that it is the French state and its civil organization that has allowed for such progressive thinking to take place. By examining the French civil code and its content, he highlights the significance each article has towards making French society one that fosters intellectualism. The notion that all French citizens are equal under the law and the encouragement of civilian involvement in state affairs is what allows France to harness such a vibrant thirst for knowledge. Journals and newspapers made information very accessible to the public, allowing for intellectual discussion to be prevalent in any circle of French society. The average citizen is not only literate, but has an urge to learn more, something that according to Al-Tahtawi, the average Egyptian lacks. This fast-paced desire for knowledge is what Al-Tahtawi observes as the main ingredient for France's academic achievements. But simple education reform was too slow a process for cultivating a vibrant intellectualism. If true reform was to take place, Egyptian society as a whole needed to change just as much as its political system. He argues that Egypt's government needed to veer away from the absolute rule of the monarch and allow civilians to more freely participate in their nation's affairs. With this participation, citizens have more ownership over the politics and policies of their country, granting them the responsibility of securing their rights for both themselves and future generations. A strong sense of citizenship that transcends religious lines would unite the people of Egypt and thus encourage the populace to seek knowledge in order to strengthen the nation. The conditioning of a new Republican Egyptian citizenship would be a long and grueling process. So in order to jumpstart this societal change, Al-Tahtawi encouraged Egypt's colonialism and conquest of Sudan and the Levant as a way to revive the lost imperial glory of the pharaohs. Living in France during the July Revolution of 1830, Al-Tahtawi saw firsthand how the French conquest of Algeria helped solidify the legitimacy and popularity of the new monarchy. Thus, he believed that a demonstration of Egypt's strength and militarism over others would create a sense of national pride and patriotism within the Egyptian populace. With a strong sense of national identity, Egyptians would be encouraged to sustain and expand the glory of their nation. Then and only then could Egypt become a modernized nation like those of Europe. Having said that, unlike the French, Al-Tahtawi didn't see colonialism as a benefit to the colonized. Being part of Egypt's colonial mission in Sudan later in his career, Al-Tahtawi saw that trying to make the Sudanese like modernized Egyptians was futile, as he sincerely believed that the people there were too primitive and stupid to adopt any of his ideals. Egyptian colonialism in Sudan only made the living conditions of the Sudanese worse as they heavily taxed the locals, plundered their pyramids, and increased the traffic of an already lucrative slave trade. As far as Al-Tahtawi and the Egyptian state were concerned, the colonization of Sudan was purely for the pride and glory of Egypt. After his return from France, he would continue to write in the hopes of rejuvenating the greatness of his precious Egypt. He persuaded Muhammad Ali Pasha to cease the gifting of Egyptian artifacts to European nations and instead preserve them as relics of Egypt's history and identity. In 1838, Al-Tahtawi would publish the History of Ancient Egypt, which would only emphasize the significance Egypt's ancient past had on its modern identity. Before this, Egyptians thought little of their ancient heritage as they never bothered to research it and allowed Europeans to keep whatever they stole from the tombs of pharaohs. Al-Tahtawi changed all that by drawing an intimate connection between Egypt's national identity and its ancient past, promoting the establishment of the country's own museums and Egyptology institutions. In truth, modern Egyptian nationalism owes its ideological foundations to the advocacy and writings of Rifa al-Tahtawi. However, al-Tahtawi's works have inspired far more than just Egypt. His ideal institutional and societal reforms were encouraged throughout the entirety of the Islamic world. Although a devout Muslim, he sincerely believed that the secular sciences and a republican political system did not contradict Islam. In fact, he argued that Islam was more than capable of introducing these Western concepts while remaining true to the religion, as pluralist governments and science were things Islam had promoted before. Concepts like this, the combination of Western institutions and Islamic society, would initiate an entire intellectual movement known as Islamic modernism, an ideology which would continue to inspire a vast array of different thinkers and political organizations. More importantly, the works of Al-Tahtawi created the ideological basis of a modern Arab identity, one that prides itself in the glory of the Islamic Khilafahs, while distinguishing itself from others as its own separate nation. He brought forth an Arab consciousness that had never truly existed before, stating that the Arab peoples have far more in common with the French than they do with the Turks due to their propensity towards freedom. Indeed, Al-Tahtawi is by all means the intellectual father of the Al-Nahda, an intellectual era that would define the modern Arab identity. But questions of what this identity entails and who it should include would continue to be pondered long after the days of Rifa al-Tahtawi. As we've seen, the dawn of the 19th century was one that humbled the Islamic world. For over 1,000 years, Islam and the imperial powers it produced were the vanguards of human art, learning, power, and wealth. Although divided, the Ummah's dominance on the global stage proved to Muslims that their ways were divinely bestowed upon them, destined to bring justice and order to a world once dominated by lost unbelievers. However, with the demonstration of Europe's superior armies, governments, and technology, the Muslim world was left questioning what they did wrong to be outdone by the infidel. Instead of blaming their subordination on the overwhelming power and corruption of Western empires, Muslim scholars of the 18th and 19th centuries were instead blaming themselves for straying away from their religion. They concluded that their governments, and in particular the Ottomans, were corrupt and impious in their ruling. Had the Muslim world followed the true Islam, like that of the Prophet and his companions, such a humiliating punishment from Allah would not have occurred. The Salafiyya movement, named in reference to the Salaf, the first 3 generations of Muslims, would spearhead the course of reviving what they considered to be the correct form of Islam. While many Salafiyya movements have emerged, by far the most famous appeared in what is now Saudi Arabia. Considering the pilgrimage to the tombs and shrines of Muslim saints to be a form of idolatry, a scholar by the name of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab would champion a strict Salafist reading of Islamic theology. Allying himself with the ruler of Dariyah, Muhammad ibn Saud, this Wahhabi movement would become the ideological basis for an emerging Saudi Emirat. In 1803, this new state would capture the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, which had been under the control of the Ottomans for nearly 3 centuries. This occupation was short-lived as the Egyptian army under Muhammad Ali Pasha would recapture the cities and crush the Saudi state by 1818. Nevertheless, it demonstrates the sharp defiance that the Ottoman authorities faced over their fellow Muslim subjects. The call to overthrow the Ottomans from the throne of the Khalifa was a threat for the empire's survival. Ottoman authority had fallen ill by the 19th century, with the majority Christian provinces of the Balkan violently demanding their independence. To lose authority in Christian lands was one thing, but to lose legitimacy in the Islamic realm could mean the complete collapse of the imperial dynasty. This threat almost came to fruition in the 1830s when Muhammad Ali Pasha's Egypt nearly overthrew the Ottomans altogether. Had it not been for the intervention of Russia, Britain and France, the Ottoman throne would have been controlled by one of their former subjects. Despite their preservation, the blatant reliance on infidel European powers only furthered the illegitimacy of Ottoman authority in Muslim lands. To counter this sentiment, the Ottomans devised an ideological reformation to help solidify their position as the Khalifas. Needing to establish a sense of citizenship amongst its subjects, the Ottomans passed a reform edict in 1856 that made all civilians in the empire equal citizens, irrespective of their creed. Following the European trend of nation-states, the Ottomans attempted to create a national identity for the empire. In 1865, a secretive group of intellectuals, known as the Young Ottomans, would attempt to create a national Ottoman identity. Dissatisfied with the Tanzimat reforms and the empire's subjugation to European demands, the Young Ottomans sought to intellectualize an authentic national identity that could correspond with parliamentarianism, constitutionalism, and liberalism. The new national ideology would become known as Ottomanism. Though inspired by and aspiring to formulate a European-style constitution and government, the Young Ottomans emphasized the importance of maintaining the empire's Islamic character, as for them, religion lay at the foundation of the nation's authority, legitimacy, and identity. Although wanting to adopt the policies of Christian Europe, the Young Ottomans and other Muslim intellectuals like Rifa Al-Tahtawi still considered the Islamic faith to be sound and even superior to that of their Western counterparts. This issue of straying behind the West was one of governmentality, not religion. In their eyes, the ideas of nationhood, parliamentarianism, and liberalism did not contradict Islam. Islam as a religion and a way of life was not in need of reform, just the governments that championed it. Before the 19th century, Muslims did not place such a great deal of political importance on a nation's territoriality. This perception was beginning to change around the time of Al-Tahtawi's writings, who himself emphasized the importance of having pride for one's birthplace. Creating a sense of national identity and connection to a territory not only created a stronger sense of citizenship, but also a greater sense of patriotism that soldiers would have pride in fighting for. Taking from Rifa's example in Egypt, the Young Ottomans sought to apply the same logic to the whole of the Ottoman Empire, encouraging a national identity that, whilst taking root from Islam, encompassed all citizens regardless of creed. Including non-Muslim subjects as part of this new national movement was extremely important for Ottomanism to work, as much of the empire's decline was due to Christian provinces demanding independence. If non-Muslims felt as though they were citizens of this Muslim nation, there would be no need to seek secession. The millet system, which allowed for the practice of separate legal practices among different religious groups, would be maintained, but matters such as education, taxation, and conscription were to be applied equally. Despite these efforts, both Muslim and non-Muslim subjects rejected Ottomanism, as it would challenge a system the two both enjoyed. For Muslims, Ottomanism meant the elimination of their superior status to non-Muslims, and although technically seen as second-class citizens, non-Muslims enjoyed the autonomy and privileges provided to them by the millet system. Though in constant disagreement with one another, one thing that the young Ottomans agreed on was that their Islamic faith was compatible with the Western notions of parliamentary democracy and liberalism. This is best demonstrated in the writings of Namik Kemal, who was one of the most influential members of the young Ottomans. A controversial personality, Kemal published a multitude of journals, poems, and plays that would see him exiled from his home. He believed that the state of Ottoman governance was one of widespread corruption and little to no accountability, of which European powers could easily exploit and manipulate. Criticizing the authoritarian rule of Sultan Abdulaziz, Kemal took inspiration from the British parliamentary system and its constitution as a way to implement accountable government and liberal freedoms to the civilian population. Despite the Western influence, Kemal maintained that adhering to Islam was not only necessary for the empire's survival, but also compatible with liberal democratic principles. He brings examples of councils already existing within the Ottoman Empire, in spite of the heterogeneous nature of the population and the democratic elements of Islamic doctrine within the Quran and Sunnah. He cites a hadith saying that the Prophet once said that the leader of the tribe is its servant. One of his major manifestos is titled, "And seek their counsel in the matter," which is taken from Surah 3 verse 159 of the Quran. To quote him directly, "The state is a moral personality. The making of laws is tantamount to its will, and the execution of laws is its actions. As long as both of these are held in the same hands, the actions of the government can never be saved from the unfettered exercise of will. Thus the necessity for a council of the Ummah arises from this." Kemal would be one of the primary architects of the Ottoman constitution. In 1876, during the reign of Abdulhamid II, the Ottoman constitution and parliament were established, seeing the first wave of elections ever held in the empire's history. However, due to the loss of the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878 and disagreements between the Sultan and the parliament, the General Assembly was disbanded in 1878, with Abdulhamid exercising absolute rule over the empire. The new Sultan had inherited an empire on the brink of bankruptcy, civil strife, and collapse. The Orthodox Christian populations of the Balkans and Armenia were revolting and encouraging the Russian Empire to intervene. Ottoman territory in Europe and the Caucasus were directly being threatened, and the empire was becoming more reliant on Britain, France, and Germany for protection and loans. To strengthen the Ottoman state, Abdulhamid initiated measures to centralize the control of the empire. The construction of railways and telegraph networks across the empire made communication and transportation easier for both citizens and the state. The establishment of primary, secondary, professional, and military schools advanced education across the empire, encouraging students to learn the methods and technology of the West, whilst continuing to maintain their Islamic moral principles. To avoid secession due to nationalism, Abdulhamid propagated a pan-Islamist ideology that encouraged Muslims from all over the world to see his status as Amir al-Mu'mineen, commander of the faithful, as the legitimate successor to the Prophet Muhammad. This campaign would be spread throughout the world, reaching Muslims across Africa, Europe, and India. Despite these efforts, however, the Ottoman Empire would continue to spiral into debt and civil resistance. Abdulhamid harshly clamped down on dissidents utilizing secret police forces, closing down critical journals, and massacring rebellious minorities. In 1908, a group of political activists known as the Young Turks forced the restoration of the Ottoman parliament and constitution. Abdulhamid would be overthrown in 1909 and succeeded by his half-brother Mehmed V, who ruled the empire during a time of political upheaval, secessionist conflicts, and the First World War. After being defeated by the Allied forces, the remaining territory of the Ottomans would be divided by Britain and France. The Muslim subjects of the Khalifa were now under the direct rule of foreign infidel powers. By 1920, almost every corner of the Muslim world was now in some shape or form under the imperial influence of Western powers. The economy, laws, governance, and technology of the infidel Western empires were penetrating nearly every aspect of Muslim society. The attempt at Western imitation eventually led the Ottomans and other Islamic empires into Western subjugation. And while many in the Ummah acknowledged the wrongdoings of their state representatives, the overwhelming power of the West was something that they could no longer ignore. If the Muslims were to regain their piety, sovereignty, and past glory, they were going to need to get rid of the Western powers. By the late 19th century, Western powers, and in particular the British, managed to politically manipulate the three major empires of the Islamic realm by the late 19th century. The Mughals by this point had been completely absorbed into the British Raj of India. The Qajar dynasty of Iran lost its holdings in the Kafkaz to Russia and were coming under the increasing influence of both the Tsars and British monarchy. The Ottoman Empire was now the sick man of Europe, continuously losing its territorial holdings, as well as becoming increasingly indebted to European lenders. With the champions of the Islamic world slowly becoming subjects of the colonial powers, Muslim scholars needed to think of ways to revive Islamic society's lost sense of intellectual vigor and political sovereignty by any means necessary. In India, where colonial influence was most heavily felt in the Islamic world, violent rebellions against British occupation were common occurrences during the 19th century. After the Indian Mutiny of 1857, India became an official possession of the British Crown, and the Mughal dynasty that had ruled the subcontinent for over 3 centuries was disbanded. In the wake of this tightening grip on India, Muslim intellectuals thought of ways to liberate the Ummah from the tentacles of Western imperialism. One of the earliest and most prominent of these thinkers was the Islamic scholar Sir Sayyid Ahmad Khan. Born into Indian nobility and having had a career with the East Indian Company, Ahmad Khan remained loyal to the British throughout India's rebellions. In spite of his close connections to the British authorities, Ahmad Khan published The Causes of the Indian Revolt in 1859, which pointed to the policy failures of the colonial administration for having created such unrest. In his writings, Khan explains that the colonial government never included the voices of the Indian public in their legislation or politics. With no public space or institutions to air grievances, the colonial subjects were forced to resort to violent uprisings. Thus, it is imperative for Indians to have a voice in government affairs if the colony is to maintain stability. Although advocating for native Indians to have a voice in government, Khan insisted for the continuation of Britain's colonial authority over India. Beyond the government's role in excluding Indians from legislative affairs, Khan ultimately believed that the biggest reason for the mutiny was the ignorance and backwardness of the native Indians, insisting that the public generally misunderstood the purpose and benefits of the colonial laws bestowed upon them. In fact, he thought many of India's Muslims had strayed away from the proper teachings of Islam due to the colonial government's efforts in hindering religious education. Therefore, the colonial government was also ignorant of the cultural and religious practices of its subjects. The colonial government was also insistent in the social categorization and separation of Hindu and Muslim Indians, conducting censuses that emphasized religious difference as the main communal factor. This new pressure to form holistic groupings pushed Khan to formulate a more cohesive Muslim community in India, one that saw itself as separate from the majority Hindu community, which had a better relationship with the British. Muslim India, however, was very divided among different Sufi brotherhoods and interpretations of the faith. So, to homogenize the Indian Muslim community, Khan attempted to promote a standardized Islam, opening up schools and universities across India that taught theology as well as Western sciences and literature. Khan believed that contrary to traditional Islam, the religious outlook of Indian Muslims was hostile to education and science, contributing to their backwardness and ultimately their subjugation. If people do not shun blind adherence, if they do not seek specially that light which can be found in the Quran and the indisputable Hadith, and do not adjust religion and the sciences of today, Islam will become extinct in India. On top of hoping to educate Indian Muslims, Khan also wished to create a national community, promoting the use of Urdu as the lingua franca of Islamic India. Though at first an advocate of Muslim-Hindu unity, Khan believed that the development of an Islamic India separate from a Hindu one would be more pragmatic in the wake of a British withdrawal. This two-nation theory would form the ideological basis of what would eventually become the national project of Pakistan. Despite his ideas gaining prominence among many Indian Muslims, Khan had his fair share of critics and opponents. Many Indian Muslims rejected Khan's attempts at standardizing Islam and the adopting of the Western notion of a nation-state in order to find comfort in a world being shaped by infidel imperialists. Perhaps Khan's most vocal and famous critic was a cleric by the name of Jamaluddin al-Afghani. With much of his early life being shrouded in mystery, Afghani's origins are disputed. Many historians believe he was actually born in Iran, despite what his nisbah suggests. What is known is that as a young scholar, Afghani travelled to British India for higher education, where he would encounter the liberal secular arts and sciences of the imperialist infidel. Al-Afghani had his superstitions about the English and their intentions, seeing them as a threat to the Ummah's unity and stability. He despised the politics and impositions of the foreign empire and was such a vocal advocate against their occupation of India that British authorities even labelled him a Russian spy. To earn his nisbah, Afghani spent several years in Afghanistan where he attempted to persuade some of the emirs to modernize. However, the conclusions of a sibling rivalry and civil war forced him to flee to Cairo and later Istanbul. In both places, he would deliver lectures regarding science, secularism, and the future of Islamic civilization. In Egypt, Afghani proved to be influential, inspiring a number of disciples who published politically charged journals and newspapers that had large public following. Egypt was under the rule of Ismail Pasha, who had amassed a great deal of debt from Britain and France after they had financed the construction of the Suez Canal and other developmental projects. Afghani saw the Pasha's reforms in relationship to the Western powers as only serving the interests of the latter, at the expense and exploitation of the Muslim world. In 1879, the British and French intervened in the affairs of the Egyptian crown by replacing Ismail with his son Tawfiq, which angered much of the Egyptian public and army, culminating in the overthrow of the government. Afghani and many of his supporters supported and conspired with the Urabi revolt, with the scholar himself being a known member of the Freemasons. After the British suppressed the Egyptian revolt, Afghani moved to Europe, where he spent time in Paris and London with anti-imperialists and Muslim expats. In Paris, Afghani founded an anti-British newspaper called Al-Urwat al-Wuthqa, the indissoluble link, which called for the unity of Muslims across the world against Western imperialism. Afghani associated himself with the pan-Islamist efforts of Namik Kemal and Sultan Abdul Hamid II, who he believed had the potential to spearhead a pan-Islamic nation. Frustrated with the concessions given to Western empires by the Qajar Shah Nasir al-Din, Afghani conspired with Iranian dissidents to assassinate the Persian king. In 1896, Nasr al-Din was assassinated with his killer being sentenced to execution and Afghani avoiding arrest by living in Turkey. He would die a year later from cancer, but his ideas would continue to live on in many Islamic circles. As well as a political activist, Afghani was also a scholarly figurehead of extreme importance, as he served as an intellectual counterweight to Western authors, and most notably Sayyid Ahmad Khan on the subject of Islam. Unlike Khan, Afghani did not see the efforts of England's civilizational mission as positive, but rather as exploitative and barbaric. He believed secularism to be an inadequate form of government, as it had no moral basis for leaders and governments to follow outside of the fear of revolution. Instead of conforming to impious institutions and nationalistic divisions enforced by the very infidel who wished to bend Islamic civilization to their will, Afghani saw Islam as the primary principle through which Muslims could achieve liberation from their oppressors and create the path towards modernity independent from European imperialism. Despite their disagreements regarding British imperialism, both Afghani and Khan shared a common advocacy for education and reform. Although against the imposition of secular institutions, Afghani nevertheless encouraged the learning of Western philosophy and sciences as a means to better equip the Muslim world in the face of changing times. Like Khan, Afghani not only believed Islam to be compatible with modernity, but he also believed that the primary culprit of Islamic civilization's decline was that of Muslim scholars and religious leaders. The strangest thing of all is that our ulama these days have divided science into two parts. One they call Muslim science, and the other one European science. Because of this, they forbid others to teach some of the useful sciences. They have not understood that science is that noble thing that has no connection with any nation and is not distinguished by anything but itself. Rather, everything that is known by science, and every nation that becomes renowned through science. Men must be related to science, not science to men. How very strange it is that the Muslims study those sciences ascribed to Aristotle with the greatest delight, as if Aristotle were one of the pillars of the Muslims. However, if the discussion relates to Galileo, Newton and Kepler, they consider them infidels. In spite of their differences, Al-Afghani and Khan both saw the close-mindedness of their fellow Muslims as the biggest danger to Islamic civilization's health and prosperity. For the both of them, education was the remedy to counter perceived Muslim backwardness, and that the only people truly holding them back were their own people and governments. Nevertheless, the question of how to confront the colonizers remained a contentious subject. Thinkers like Ahmad Khan believed that conforming to the institutions, philosophies, and wishes of the colonizers was the best way to modernize in a similar light. But Afghani and his students saw this capitulation as inherently exploitative and un-Islamic. Despite having passed away in 1897, Afghani's ideals continued to inspire and motivate Muslim thinkers for generations, especially through the continued writings of his one-time student and friend Muhammad Abdur. Having met Afghani in his home country of Egypt, Abdur became one of the scholar's many students and fellow Freemason colleagues. After having been expelled from Egypt due to his involvement in the Urabi Revolution, Abdur joined his mentor in Paris to help him publish journals and newspapers, calling for pan-Islamic unity. In 1887, Abdur returned to Egypt where he became a judge, a board member of Al-Azhar University, and one of the country's leading religious scholars. Later in life, the two thinkers would have a falling out and refuse to speak to each other until Afghani's death. For the remainder of his life, Abdur advocated for the reform of Islamic law, education, and the Arabic language, supporting the establishment of schools for girls and bringing changes to the Sharia courts. Like his one-time mentor before him, Abdur believed that these reforms would ease the stagnant mind of the world's Muslims and hopefully bring about a united Islamic Ummah. This sentiment towards reforming the Muslim mind and promoting pan-Islamism is best demonstrated in his work entitled Theology of Unity, where he argued that Islam as a religion was built on reason and had no contradictory principles. He called for Muslims to utilize their logic and reason in order to properly approach Islamic theology, arguing that Islam, forbids us to be slavishly credulous, and for our stimulus, points to the morals of peoples who simply followed their fathers with complacent satisfaction, and were finally involved in an utter collapse of their beliefs and their own disappearance as a community. Like Afghani, Khan, and many other Muslim reformist thinkers before him, Abdur saw the blind following of teachers, taqlid, as detrimental to the Muslim community, as it undermines the believer's capacity for reason, otherwise known as ijtihad. Islam as a religion encourages the use of reason when confronting its content and the broader world with the Quran, declaring that, surely the worst of beasts in God's sight are those that are deaf and dumb and do not reason. Abdur made it clear that any theological divisions, acts of treachery and/or heresy were not products of Islam, but rather the consequences of mankind's corruption and self-interest. Thus, if a society were to truly reform itself into one that wholeheartedly followed the Quran and the teachings of the Prophet, Muslim individuals were going to have to first reform themselves. Therefore, what Abdur and others like him began was not just a race against Western imperialism, but also a quest for defining the Muslim soul. The intellectual basis for a pan-Islamic reformation was in place, but who was to lead the political charge of this struggle would remain a question to this very day. The vibrancy of Muslim intellectual thought in the 19th century allowed Muslim societies to be in a better position to resist European imperialism. The domination of Europe came not only in the shape of colonizing territories, but also ideas. Western concepts about societal structure and political organization, backed by immense economic and military power, threatened to overwhelm the very identity of Muslim societies. But Islamic intellectual activity in this period served as a challenge, albeit a modest one, to European cultural hegemony. As is often the case in history, the true fruits of these endeavors would be realized well after the 19th century. From the ideas of the young Ottomans and Sir Sayyid Ahmad Khan, we can genealogically trace their impact on nationalist thinkers in the 20th century. And from the Islamic-inspired intellectuals, there is a direct line of influence to modern Salafism, as well as Islamic fundamentalism, which has more recently captured the world's attention. Thank you guys for watching. As usual, a big thank you to my patrons for continuing to support the channel. A special thanks goes out to Sultan Skinny for his help in the writing of the script. Please check out his channel for other awesome videos about Islamic history. Until next time, peace.